Humans were just ancient myths, then Earth soldiers descended onto the battlefield. The records had been sitting in the vault for 11,000 years. Nobody touched them anymore. The great memory vaults of Verith Prime held the history of every known species in the galaxy, every war, every alliance, every world that had ever burned or bloomed. Scholars came and went, reading about ancient empires and forgotten battles. But there was one entry near the bottom of the oldest archive that most of them walked right past without a second look. It said, simply, the Pale Ones. 2 legs. Soft bodies. Unusually persistent. Last confirmed sighting, approximately 3,200 galactic cycles ago. Most historians did not even stop to read the full entry. A species that had not been seen in over 3,000 years was, by any reasonable measure, extinct. The galaxy moved on. New powers rose. New wars started. The Pale Ones, or humans, as a few broken fragments of their own records called them, were filed away as a curiosity. Maybe they had existed. Maybe the old records were wrong. Either way, it did not matter. Except to one historian named Solander. Solander was not young. He had spent 43 years of his long Verity life inside libraries, reading rooms, and archive halls. His colleagues respected him, but they also quietly felt a little sorry for him. A mind as sharp as his, wasted on ghost stories. That was how they saw it. He had published 12 papers on human civilization and received polite, thin applause for each one. The academic community of the Confederacy had made up its mind long ago. Humans were a myth. An interesting one, perhaps, but a myth all the same. Solander did not agree. He sat at his desk on the evening that would later change everything, surrounded by holographic projections of old text. The light from the displays caught the deep gray of his skin and made him look older than he was. He was tracing a linguistic pattern, a small detail that most people would have missed. A single word, repeated across 6 different ancient sources, each from a different species, each from a different part of the galaxy. The word was always the same. It appeared in contexts describing moments of unexpected rescue, sudden reversals of impossible battles, arrivals that nobody had predicted. The word, in every case, roughly translated to, they came. He leaned back and pressed his fingers together. The Drenthaki swarm had been tearing through Confederacy colony worlds for 22 years. World after world had fallen. The Confederacy's military response had been slow, bureaucratic, and ultimately not enough. Planets were evacuated. People were lost. And still the swarm came, because the swarm always came, because that was what the swarm did. It consumed. It moved. It did not stop. Solander was not a military man. He could not stop the swarm. But something about the current moment felt familiar to him in a way that sat uncomfortably in his chest. He had read enough ancient records to recognize the pattern. A galaxy in crisis. A war with no end in sight. And somewhere in the old files, the whisper of something that had shown up before, unexpected, unexplained, and decisive. He opened the oldest file again and read the entry for the 100th time. The Pale Ones. 2 legs. Soft bodies. Unusually persistent. He stared at the word persistent for a long time. Far from Verith Prime, on the other side of the galaxy where the stars grew thin and the mapped territories ended, a very different kind of history was being made. Cavith 7 was not a beautiful world. It smelled like old chemicals and wet stone. The sky was the color of a bruise most of the day, and the ground had a way of sucking at your boots if you stood still too long. The locals, what few had remained before the evacuation, had called it home. The soldiers who had come after the evacuation called it other things, most of which were not polite. Colonel Dan Harlow had been on Cavith 7 for 6 months. He was a tall man with a calm face and tired eyes, the kind of tired that did not come from lack of sleep but from too many years of making hard decisions. He stood inside the forward operations tent with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the holographic map that floated above the planning table like a glowing ghost. The map showed everything. Enemy positions, marked in red. Confederacy lines, marked in blue and looking thin and uncertain. And in between, a stretch of contested ground that had been soaked in too much blood already, from species that Den was only beginning to learn the names of. This was not Earth's war. That was the official position. Earth's government had said so publicly, carefully, and more than once. The United Earth Expeditionary Force was not at war with the Drenthaki swarm. They were simply present. In an advisory capacity. Near the front. With weapons. Dan had been told not to worry too much about the politics. His job was the ground in front of him. His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Kara Simmons, walked in from the cold and set a datapad on the table without ceremony. Kara was younger than Dan by about 15 years, but she had a mind that moved fast and never wasted words. She tapped the datapad once to wake it up and slid it toward him. Drenthaki forward lines haven't moved since yesterday, she said. They're sitting on the high ground north of the river crossing. They've been there before every major push in this region. Same pattern, same setup, same approach. Dan looked at the datapad. And the Confederacy's plan? Same as last time. Defensive positioning. Wait for the swarm to overextend. Then try to push back. She paused. It didn't work last time. No, Dan agreed. It didn't. He turned back to the map. His soldiers were out there, most of them resting in rotation shifts, a few on watch. 3,800 men and women, pulled from every corner of Earth, trained for exactly this kind of environment. They had been briefed on the Drenthaki before deployment. They had studied the swarm's tactics, its collective behavior, the way it coordinated through something that wasn't quite language and wasn't quite instinct but was somewhere in between. Dan had made sure his people understood one thing above all else: the swarm did not expect surprises. It was very good at absorbing predictable attacks. It was built for that. What it was not built for was something that changed shape mid-battle, that adapted faster than the swarm could redirect its attention. That was the plan. Not in those exact words, the formal operations order used more technical language, but that was the heart of it. Kara was looking at him with the expression she wore when she had something more to say. He nodded at her to continue. The Confederacy officers in the Southern Command Post asked again today about our force composition, she said. They want a formal briefing. They're confused about who we are. Dan almost smiled. What did you tell them? I told them we'd send someone over. She picked up her datapad. Should I schedule it? Not yet, Dan said. Let them wonder a little longer. Confused allies ask fewer questions and stay out of the way. Kara nodded and walked out. Dan stayed at the map for a while longer, tracing the red lines with his eyes. The swarm was patient. The swarm was large. The swarm had beaten every force the Confederacy had sent at it for 2 decades. But the swarm had never met anyone from Earth. Dan did not think about that with pride or excitement. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, as a simple fact that needed to be used correctly. He reached over and turned the map off. The tent went quiet. Outside, the wind moved across Cavith 7's ugly sky, and somewhere in the dark, his soldiers were resting, cleaning their gear, eating bad food, and waiting. They were very good at waiting. It was one of the things humans had always been good at. #humans were just ancient myths. Then Earth's soldiers descended onto the battlefield. The trench was not deep enough. Yethko had dug it himself, with his bare hands and a broken piece of hull plating, in the 20 minutes between when his unit was overrun and when the Drenthaki closed the last exit route behind them. It was barely deep enough to lie flat in, and the mud at the bottom was cold and smelled like something chemical and wrong. He lay in that trench and listened to the sounds of the world ending around him. Yethko was a border scout for the Confederacy's 14th Perimeter Division. He was experienced. He had been in bad situations before. He knew how to be calm when being calm was the only thing left available to him. But this was different from bad situations he had been in before, because those situations had all carried at least a thin thread of possibility, a route out, a communicator that still worked, a unit somewhere within reach. He had none of those things now. His communicator had taken damage during the initial strike. It made noise when he turned it on but sent nothing. His unit, 11 soldiers, people he had trained with, shared meals with, were gone. He had not seen them go down. One moment they were there, and the next the swarm had moved through the area like a wave, and when the wave passed, he was the only one still breathing. He had managed to play dead long enough for the forward elements of the swarm to pass over him. Then he had crawled. Then he had dug. Now he lay in the trench in the dark, and he composed his final memory log. It was something Verity soldiers were trained to do. You recorded your name, your unit, your last known position, and whatever observations you had made that might be useful to those who came after. It was a final act of duty. A way of making the death mean something, even if only in a small way. He was halfway through the recording when he heard something that stopped him completely. Movement. Not Drenthaki movement. He knew what that sounded like, a low, vibrating shuffle, many bodies moving together with a rhythm that was almost like a heartbeat. This was different. This was individual. Deliberate. And nearly silent in a way that was almost unnatural for creatures moving through rough terrain in the dark. Yethko pressed himself lower into the mud and turned his head slowly. Shapes moved along the ridge above his trench. He counted 6 of them, then lost count. They were upright, 2 legs, 2 upper limbs, heads that were rounded and smooth. They wore armor that he did not recognize, dark and close-fitted, with no visible markings he could identify. They moved in a loose formation that made no immediate sense to him and yet felt deeply organized, like watching a machine do something complicated and efficient without understanding the mechanics behind it. They did not speak. They used small hand signals, quick, specific movements that clearly communicated something to the others, because each signal produced an immediate and coordinated response. One would gesture, and 2 others would shift their position without hesitation, without discussion, without the half-second delay that most soldiers needed to process an instruction. Yethko held completely still. He was not sure what he was looking at. He was not sure if it was something that would kill him. His instincts were giving him conflicting information. They were moving tactically and that meant soldiers, but nothing about their shape or their equipment matched any Confederacy unit he had ever seen. One of the shapes stopped. It turned its head. And then it crouched down and looked directly at him. Yethko's hearts both stopped, he was certain of it. The shape studied him for a moment. Its face was strange, flat in the front, with 2 forward-facing eyes that caught no light the way Verity eyes did, 2 small openings above a wider mouth. The expression was unreadable, but the posture was not threatening. It was curious. The shape tilted its head to one side, just slightly, and made a sound. "You hurt," it said. The words were in Verity. Clumsy, heavily accented Verity, but Verity. The shape had asked if he was hurt, and for a long moment, Yethko's brain refused to move past that single fact. It spoke Verity. He did not answer immediately. The shape did not wait long. It reached to its side and produced a small device, round and flat, and pressed it gently against Yethko's left side. A warmth spread from the contact point, and the pain that he had not even fully registered, a deep bruised ache from where he had been thrown during the overrun, went quiet and still. A medical device. It had just used a medical device on him without asking and without hesitation. The shape looked back up at the ridge and made a hand signal to the others. They kept moving, flowing past the trench like water around a stone, silent and continuous. The shape stayed crouched beside him for a moment longer, long enough to look him over once more with those flat, forward-facing eyes. Then it stood and followed the others. Yethko lay in the mud and listened. What he heard over the next 40 minutes was not the sound of a battle in the way he understood battles. There was no long, grinding exchange of fire. There was no back-and-forth advance and retreat that could be tracked and predicted. What he heard was a series of sharp, precise events, quick bursts of sound, movement that started and stopped in tight rhythms, and then a silence that grew and held and did not break the way silences during battle usually did. The silence after a battle that was still happening was always uneasy. It was the silence of things regrouping. This silence was different. This was the silence of things being finished. Then the shape came back. It appeared at the edge of the trench and reached a limb down toward him. The limb ended in 5-fingered hands. He had noticed that before, but it was still strange to look it up close. He took the offered hand, and it pulled him upright with an ease that surprised him given how physically slight the shape appeared. He stood on shaking legs and looked around. The ridge was clear. The Drenthaki positions that had been cutting off his retreat, positions he had observed and memorized and then accepted as permanent features of his death, were gone. Not retreated. Gone. He turned back to the shape. It was looking at him with an expression that might, possibly, have been patience. "What are you?" Yethko asked. His voice came out smaller than he intended. The shape reached up and removed the front portion of its helmet, and the face underneath was fully visible for the first time. It was young, he thought, though he had no real basis for judging the age of something he had never seen before. The skin was a warm brown color. The eyes were dark and calm. There was something in the expression that he could only describe as steady, not cold, not aggressive, just very, very settled. Corporal Lena Price, the shape said. Third Combined Arms. You are safe now. It paused, and then added, in slightly more careful verity, let us get you out of here. Yethko asked again, quieter this time. What species? What are you? Lena Price looked at him for a moment. There was no drama in her answer. No weight placed on it. She said it the way someone states their name or their rank, a simple fact, offered without ceremony. Human, she said. And then she turned and began moving, because there was still work to do, and standing still in a cleared combat zone was not something her training encouraged. Yethko followed her on legs that barely worked, and he turned the word over in his mind the entire way. Human. He had read that word once, in a very old file, at the bottom of an archive that most people walked past without looking. He had not thought it was real. #humans were just ancient myths. Then Earth soldiers descended onto the battlefield. The report from Yethko arrived at Solander's personal terminal at 0400 station time. It was flagged as a field incident document, routine categorization, the kind of thing that got routed through the archive system automatically because it contained observational data from a border scout. Under normal circumstances, Solander would not have even seen it until morning. But the automated keyword scan had caught something in the text, and that was why the flag was sitting at the top of his queue when he woke 3 hours early from a restless sleep and went to his desk without knowing why. He opened the file. He read the first paragraph and went very still. He read it again. Then he read the rest of it without moving, without making a sound, without even fully breathing, the way a person holds themselves when they are afraid that any small movement might break something delicate. When he finished, he sat for a long moment in the blue light of his terminal. Then he opened every database he had access to and began to work. He did not stop for 72 hours. He pulled the physical description from Yethko's report and ran it against every biological record in the Confederacy's archive. 2 legs. 5-fingered hands. Forward-facing eyes. Flat facial structure. Soft outer skin in a range of pigment shades. Rounded skull. The search returned one match, buried at the bottom of a catalog entry from 11,000 years ago. He pulled the behavioral data. The hand signal communication system. The near-silent movement. The small unit tactics. The speed of decision-making in the field. He compared it to every military doctrine in the archive, ancient and modern. Nothing matched exactly. But when he pulled the fragmentary records from pre-fracture contact events, the ones that most of his colleagues dismissed as unreliable mythology, he found echoes. Small ones, distorted by time, but there. He pulled the linguistic data. Yethko had recorded several audio fragments during the encounter without realizing it. The communicator that could not transmit could still capture local sound. The language the shapes used when they spoke to each other was clipped, fast, and largely unfamiliar. But Solander had spent 40 years reading dead language fragments, and he recognized the root structures. He had seen them before in the oldest files. Written versions, partial and damaged, from ruins on a dead moon in the mid-spiral. He ran the audio through his translation model. The model gave him confidence ratings between 60 and 80% on most fragments, which was actually very high for a language with no living native speakers in the database. Some of the words came through cleanly. The word for a rank of leadership. The word for a direction. The word for what appeared to be a unit designation. And one word that the model flagged as a species self-identifier. The word was human. Solander filed an emergency report to the Confederacy Council at 0318 on the third day without sleep. He attached everything, the linguistic analysis, the biological cross-reference, the behavioral comparison, the full chain of evidence laid out step by step in language that was as clear and simple as he could make it. He titled the report, "On the Confirmed Survival and Current Presence of the Species Catalogued as the Pale Ones." He sent it and waited. The response that came back, 6 hours later, was 3 sentences long. It thanked him for his contribution to the archive. It noted that his findings would be reviewed by the appropriate department. It wished him well in his continued research. Solander read the response twice. Then he set it aside and went back to work, because that was what he always did. The Confederacy Council was not ignoring him because they thought he was wrong. They were ignoring him because they were busy, and because the situation at Cavith 7 had changed overnight in ways that nobody had a good explanation for. General Vazorlan was the commanding officer of the Confederacy's Southern Front. He was experienced, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable with things he could not explain. He stood in his command post that morning and stared at a tactical display that no longer made sense to him. The Drenthaki forward positions that had been in place for 11 days were gone. Not retreated in an orderly sense, disrupted. The swarm's supply coordination in the southeastern corridor had been severed. 3 separate command nodes, each in a different location, had gone dark simultaneously during the pre-dawn period. There were no friendly units in those areas. The Confederacy's own forces had been holding a defensive line 12 kilometers north. His intelligence officers had no answers. His subordinate commanders had no answers. Everyone had the same expression, the quiet, slightly embarrassed look of people who could see that something had happened but could not work out what. Vazorlan was still working through the 3rd damage report when his aide told him that someone had arrived at the forward command post entrance and was asking to come in. Which unit? Vazorlan asked without looking up. That is the question, sir, his aide said carefully. The visitor was a single individual. He walked into the command post with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had been inside many rooms like this one and was not especially impressed by any of them. He was carrying a bundle of flat, thin material, actual printed documents, physical pages, which nobody in the room had seen used for military purposes in a very long time. He set the bundle on the table near the entrance and looked around the room with calm, dark eyes. He was 2-legged. His skin was a light tan color. He was not large by any measure that the Verity in the room would have used to assess a soldier, but there was something in the way he stood that made the room feel slightly smaller. Sergeant Pete Garza, he said. He spoke in Galactic Standard, with a heavy accent that none of the staff officers recognized. I am with the 3rd Combined Arms, United Earth Expeditionary Force. Colonel Dan Harlow sends his regards. Nobody in the room spoke. Pete Garza waited a moment, then continued as if the silence were perfectly normal. The colonel would like to schedule a coordination meeting at 1400 hours today. He says to bring your full logistics grid and your complete order of battle. He paused briefly. He also wanted me to ask, and I am passing this on exactly as he said it, why there is a 12-kilometer gap in your southern flank. Vazorlan looked at the soldier standing in his command post. He looked at the printed documents on the table. He looked at the flat, calm face that was waiting for a response without any apparent interest in the discomfort it had caused. Then he looked back at his staff officers, none of whom had anything useful to offer. He had been a general for 19 years. He had fought in 4 major campaigns. He had learned, through experience and sometimes through pain, to recognize the particular quality of silence that followed an event he did not fully understand yet. This was that silence. What are you? He asked. He meant it as a professional question, species, affiliation, origin. He was trying to categorize the figure in front of him so that he could begin to process everything else. Pete Garza looked at him with an expression that was politely neutral. Human, sir, he said. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Vazorlan picked up the printed documents and began to read, because whatever else was happening, there was a coordination meeting at 1400, and he still did not have an explanation for his missing southern flank. Far away in his archive room, Solander was still working. He had not yet heard about the visit to the command post. But when he did hear about it, some hours later, he sat very still for a moment and then said quietly, to no one in particular. Of course they came back. #humans were just ancient myths, then Earth soldiers descended onto the battlefield. The coordination meeting started at 1400 hours exactly, because Dan Harlow was the kind of man who treated punctuality as a form of respect, and he extended that respect even to people he had only just met. He arrived at the Confederacy command post with Kara Simmons and 2 other officers, none of them armed beyond sidearms, none of them wearing full combat kit. They looked, if anything, slightly underdressed for a meeting between military forces on an active battlefield. Dan wore his field uniform, which was clean but clearly not new, and he carried a single flat document case under one arm. He shook hands with Vazorlan, a gesture the general did not quite know what to do with but managed to mirror tolerably well, and then they all sat down around the planning table. The Confederacy staff officers spent the first several minutes trying not to stare. They were not fully successful. There was something about the humans that kept pulling attention, not in a threatening way, but in the way that something genuinely unfamiliar pulls the eye, the way a color you have never seen before would, if such a thing were possible. The humans, for their part, did not seem to notice. Or if they noticed, they chose not to react, which was somehow more disconcerting. Dan opened his document case and laid out a series of printed maps on the table alongside the holographic displays the Confederacy was using. He explained, simply and without unnecessary detail, what the Third Combined Arms had done over the previous 18 hours. Where they had moved. What they had hit. What the results had been. He spoke in slow, careful galactic standard, pausing occasionally to let the staff translator catch up, never showing impatience when clarification was needed. Vazorlan listened to all of it. He was a good general, which meant he was also a good listener. And what he heard, stripped of its technical framing, was this: a force of fewer than 4,000 soldiers had, in one night, done more damage to the Drenthaki's operational capacity in this region than the Confederacy's southern front had managed in 11 weeks. He did not say this aloud. He kept his expression level and professional. But he looked at Den Harlow across the table and revised, quietly and completely, every assumption he had walked into the room with. "Your next objective?" Vazorlan asked. Den looked at Kara. Kara opened her own document case and laid a different map on the table. It showed the Drenthaki's broader position in this region, their hive anchor, which was the structure that connected and coordinated the swarm's collective thinking in this area, and the two large secondary clusters that fed into it from the east. "The hive anchor," Dan said. "If it goes down, the swarm loses coordination. What's left breaks into smaller groups. Your forces can handle smaller groups." Vazorlan studied the map. The hive anchor was deep inside Drenthaki territory. It was heavily surrounded. Every analysis his own strategists had done had placed it in the category of objectives not to be attempted without significant force multiplication and a minimum of 3 rotations of preparation time. Den was describing an attack on it in approximately the same tone he might use to discuss a maintenance schedule. "How many soldiers do you intend to use?" Vazorlan asked. Den thought for a moment. 3 elements. Roughly 1,200 each. The room went quiet. Several of the staff officers exchanged looks. 1,200 soldiers per element. Against the hive anchor and its surrounding defenses, which conservative estimates placed at 40 times that number of Drenthaki. Vazorlan chose his words carefully. "Those numbers seem very small." Dan nodded. "They are." He said it with no particular concern. "But we're not hitting it the way you'd hit it. We're not going straight at it. One element makes contact with the eastern corridor that draws the swarm's attention east. The second element cuts the supply route from the north that pulls attention north. The third hits the anchor while it's trying to look in 2 directions at once." He paused. "The swarm is very good at absorbing pressure. It is less good at processing pressure that keeps moving." Vazorlan looked at him for a moment. "And the third element, the one that hits the anchor? You will lead it personally?" "Yes." "What does it do, exactly? Beyond hitting the anchor?" "It makes noise," Dan said simply. Vazorlan did not fully understand that answer at the time. He would understand it later. The operation began 6 hours before dawn. Captain Roy Dunbar led the first element east. Roy was broad-shouldered and quiet, the kind of officer who communicated through action rather than words, and his element moved with the efficiency of people who had trained together for a very long time in very difficult conditions. They hit the Drenthaki's eastern corridor precisely when and where they were supposed to, and the swarm turned. Lieutenant Kara Simmons took the second element north. She moved faster than the timeline called for, which was deliberate. She had looked at the terrain maps and identified a window of opportunity that would close within 30 minutes of her element reaching the ridge. She pushed the pace, reached the ridge in 28 minutes, and cut the northern supply route with 11 minutes to spare. Her element then held that position for 3 hours against a swarm response that was heavy and determined and ultimately unable to get through. She did not report the difficulty back to command. She reported the status, route cut, position held, and kept working. Dan's element was the noise. They moved across a 100-kilometer front in the dark, not as a concentrated force but as many small groups, each one burning false signal signatures that looked, to the swarm's collective sensors, like a much larger force preparing for a coordinated push from multiple directions at once. The swarm, responding the way it always responded to perceived threats, by spreading toward them, thinned itself across the full front. 40,000 bodies, dispersed across 100 kilometers of contested ground, each group responding to signals that were not attached to anything real. Dan's element was the smallest of the three. He moved with them, saying very little, directing through signals and occasional brief exchanges with his squad leaders. He had a habit in the field of going very quiet, not closed off, but inward, focused, running the picture in his head in real time and adjusting for things that the plan had not accounted for. There were always things the plan had not accounted for. The best plan simply had fewer of them. The hive anchor fell at 0347, 23 minutes ahead of the operation timeline. Roy's people had been inside the outer ring of its defenses for 41 minutes by then, moving through it with a precision that the structure's automated responses could not keep up with. The anchor was large, but it was not built to handle something that moved this fast and hit this hard from inside its own perimeter. When it went down, the sound was low and deep, like something very old settling into the ground. Across the front, the swarm hesitated. That was the word the Confederacy analysts used later, in their reports. Hesitated. It was a strange word to use for something that operated on collective instinct rather than individual thought. But it was accurate. For a period of approximately 4 minutes, the Drenthaki units across the entire region stopped moving and did nothing. The signal that had been coordinating them was gone. They were still receiving input from each other, from the secondary clusters, from whatever biological processes made the swarm. But the thing that had been telling them where to push and where to hold and what to prioritize, that was silent. For minutes was not a long time. But it was enough. Vazorlin had positioned his own forces for exactly this moment, following Dan's instructions to the letter. They pushed, and they pushed hard, and the scattered, hesitating fragments of the swarm that they met were manageable in a way that the swarm had never been manageable before. By noon, the eastern corridor was clear. By evening, the northern route was in Confederacy hands. By the following morning, the Cavith 7 front had shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible 48 hours earlier. Yethko, back at his post on the southern ridge after his wounds were fully treated, watched the Drenthaki pull back from positions they had held for months. He had a datapad in his hands. He was adding to the personal record he had started in the trench, the one he had meant to be his final memory log. He wrote, "They did not fight like creatures who were afraid to die. They fought like creatures who had decided, a long time ago, that dying was just a factor. Something to be planned around." He read it back. Then he added one more line. "I do not think I have ever seen anything like them. #humans were just ancient myths, then Earth soldiers descended onto the battlefield." 6 weeks after Cavith 7, the Confederacy Council held a formal session. It was called, officially, a review of recent developments in the outer spiral conflict. Nobody in the room used the phrase, the human question, but that was what it was. That had been what it was from the moment the session was proposed. The chamber was large. The seats were arranged in a wide arc around a central floor, and the counselors filled them in a quiet, careful way that said they all understood this meeting was different from the usual ones. The mood was not hostile. It was something more complicated than hostility, a mix of uncertainty and something that some of the counselors, if they had been honest, would have admitted was close to unease. Solander stood on the central floor and looked out at them. He had not expected to be here. 3 days ago, his emergency report, the one that had received a 3-sentence reply and a wish of good luck in his continued research, had been pulled back out of the archive queue and flagged for council review. Someone, somewhere in the system, had finally read it carefully. He did not know who. He did not ask. He spent the 3 days preparing his presentation instead. He walked them through everything. The ancient records, the linguistic work, the biological cross-reference, the behavioral comparison. He kept it simple and clear, because he had learned over 40 years that simple and clear was the only way to make people accept something they did not want to accept. He did not dramatize. He did not raise his voice. He laid the facts in a row, like stones across a river, and let the council walk across them on their own. When he reached the section on Cavith 7, he showed the operational data. Numbers and maps, things the council understood and trusted. He showed what the Confederacy's own forces had been doing in the 11 weeks before the human arrival. Then he showed what had changed in 31 hours of the Cavith action. He placed both pictures side by side and said nothing for a moment, letting the comparison do its own work. Several counselors were very still. Then he showed the oldest record. He had saved it for last, not for theatrical effect but because he had always felt it belonged at the end of the argument rather than the beginning. It was an image, not a high-resolution one, not clear or detailed. It was a reproduction of a carving found on a dead moon in the mid-spiral, left by a species called the Orith, who had made contact with humans approximately 4,000 years ago and who had been extinct for 3,000 years after that. The carving showed a small upright figure between two taller figures of different shapes. Beneath the three figures, in the script of a dead language that Solander had spent 11 years learning to read, were 4 words. He translated them aloud. They showed up for us. The chamber was quiet for a long time. One of the senior counselors, an older figure named Brensalith, who had served on the council for 30 years and was not easily moved by anything, looked at the image on the display and then looked at Solander. "You believe the humans came to Cavith 7 because they chose to," Brensalith said. "Not because they were asked. The Confederacy did not ask them," Solander said. "We did not even know they existed. Nobody asked them." He paused. "They came because they saw a war they thought they could help with. That appears to be something they have done before. Possibly many times." Another counselor, younger, leaned forward. "How many of them are there?" Solander spread his hands. "I do not know. Their world is outside our mapped territories. Our oldest references to it describe it as a single planet of origin, but that was over 3,000 years ago. Based on what we observed at Cavith 7, they are capable of deploying organized forces across interstellar distances. That implies a significant infrastructure. Beyond that, I cannot say." The young counselor sat back. The unease in the room had not gone away. If anything, it had deepened, not into fear exactly, but into the particular discomfort of realizing that the galaxy was larger and more complicated than the map said it was. Brensalith looked at the carving on the display for another moment. Then the old counselor made a quiet sound that might have been a sigh. "We should talk to them," Brensalith said. "Formally. Officially." "Yes," Solander agreed. "I think we should." The news of the council session reached the forward base on Cavith 7 3 days later, in the form of a brief message to Dan Harlow from Earth Command. It informed him that Confederacy diplomatic channels had made contact with Earth's government and that formal discussions were being arranged. It also told him to expect the discussions to take some time, because they always did, and to continue his current mission in the meanwhile. Dan read the message and set it aside. The base was quieter now than it had been during the Cavith action. Not peaceful, there was still a war on, and the Drenthaki were still out there, damaged but not finished. But the immediate pressure had lifted, and the camp had settled into the particular rhythm of a force between operations. Gear was cleaned. Equipment was checked. People rested when they could, ate when they could, and talked in the way that soldiers talk when they have come through something difficult together and are trying to put it back in a manageable shape. Dan walked through the camp in the late afternoon, not inspecting, just walking, the way he liked to do when he needed to think. Cavith 7's sky was its usual bruised color, the clouds low and flat and dark at the edges. The ground pulled at his boots in the places where the mud had not dried. He passed Roy Dunbar's area. Roy was asleep on a folding cot outside his tent with his boots still on. This was standard Roy behavior. Roy had an extraordinary ability to sleep anywhere, at any time, in any conditions, and he treated this ability as seriously as he treated marksmanship or navigation. Sleep is a tactical resource, Roy had once explained, with total sincerity. Dan had agreed. He passed the section where Lena Price's squad had their tents set up. Lena was sitting outside, doing maintenance on her field kit with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything. She noticed Dan walking past and gave him the brief nod that was the camp standard greeting when nobody had the energy for anything more formal. He nodded back and kept walking. He found Kara at the edge of the camp, looking south, toward the direction the Drenthaki had retreated. She had a cup of something warm in her hands and was not drinking it, just holding it. "Council session happened," Dan said, coming to stand beside her. "I heard," Kara said. "Diplomats are going to have a busy year." "They always do." Dan looked south. The horizon was flat and dark. "How's the team?" "Good," she said. "Tired?" "Mostly good." They stood for a moment without talking. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have been through enough together that words are not always necessary. Do you think they understand? Kara asked. The Confederacy. What we are. What this is. Dan thought about the question. He thought about Vaz Orland's face in the command post, that careful, controlled expression that was working very hard to process something it had not expected. He thought about the way the staff officers had kept looking, and the way Pete had stood in that room and delivered his message as if it were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. Not yet, he said. But they will. Kara nodded slowly. She sipped from her cup. What's next? Dan reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded message from Earth Command. He looked at it for a moment, the new coordinates, the new briefing summary, the line that said the war with the Drenthaki had entered a new phase and Earth had decided to remain involved. He put it back in his pocket. More of the same, he said. He went to find his own cup of coffee. Real coffee, from Earth, the one thing he always made sure the supply manifest included, no matter what else got cut. He poured it slowly and stood at the edge of his tent and looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, very old records in a very large vault were being reread. Somewhere up there, diplomats were learning to have conversations that nobody had thought they would ever need to have. Somewhere up there, a historian named Solander was probably still at his desk, still reading, still adding pieces to a picture that had been incomplete for 3,000 years. And somewhere out in the dark, the war was still going. Still waiting. Still requiring people willing to cross a very long distance and stand between something terrible and the people it was coming for. Dan drank his coffee. Then he went back to the planning table and got to work.